And we're live. So, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in the cyberspace today. My name is Dr. Nicholas Novaki. I'm a research officer at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and it's my great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. And today we'll be focusing on the topic of EU-NATO cooperation, a very important topic given everything that's going on currently in both the European Union and in NATO. So we'll be looking at the current state of EU-NATO cooperation, assessing its track record, and looking a bit into the future. Since the signing of the joint EU-NATO Warsaw Declaration, all the way back in 2016, cooperation between these two Brussels-based organizations has increased quite significantly, it seems. I mean, the EU and NATO have agreed to a common set of 74 proposals, if I remember correctly, which they are currently in the process of implementing, and on the implementation of which they publish yearly implementation reports so that everyone can follow where the process is. And kind of in broad terms, these proposals seek to boost EU-NATO cooperation in the areas of countering hybrid threats, operations, cybersecurity, defense capabilities, defense industry and research, and exercises. So quite a broad area of different issues in which the EU and NATO cooperate. However, there does seem to be, often when I look at EU-NATO cooperation, I get this feeling that relatively little has been achieved beyond kind of boosting staff-to-staff contacts, staff-to-staff interactions, and policy coordination between the two organizations. And then that especially concrete operational cooperation between the EU and NATO has remained rather limited since its heydays in the early 2000s. And when I say heydays, I refer especially to the things such as the signing of the EU-NATO Berlin Plus arrangements in 2002, which opened a way for the EU to use NATO's planning and command and control structures for commanding its own military operations. And these structures were used to command two EU military operations, Concordia in the Republic of Northern Macedonia, and then the ongoing EU4 Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was launched or which took over from an existing NATO operation back in 2004. But since then, there have been no other EU operations that would have used these EU-NATO Berlin Plus arrangements. And if you talk to diplomats from Europe or the United States, they quite a few of them often express that these arrangements are practically dead at the moment due to kind of internal differences and divisions between EU and NATO countries. But the good thing is that both the EU and NATO are currently looking into the future and rethinking their role in the field of security and defense, the EU through its ongoing strategic compass process and the kind of slowly forward-moving conference on the future of Europe, and then NATO through the forthcoming strategic concept process, which we expect will be launched sometime this year, and then also through its NATO 2030 initiative. And these related and somewhat overlapping processes, I think, create a pretty rare window of opportunity to also kind of rethink EU-NATO cooperation and try to identify new ways of boosting it. So for this reason, I wanted to talk today to two excellent people about different topics related to EU-NATO cooperation, and especially questions such as what has EU-NATO cooperation concretely achieved since 2016? Could EU-NATO cooperation be strengthened even further? Would it be possible to create synergies between the EU strategic compass process and NATO's upcoming strategic concept process? So, as I mentioned, we have two very excellent and highly distinguished speakers to discuss this topic with today. We have Tom van den Kendeler, member of the European Parliament from the EPP Group, who is also chair of the Delegation for Relations with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in the European Parliament. And we also have Professor Jamie Shea, former senior NATO official, and who's also a fellow at Friends of Europe, and very importantly, also a senior research associate at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. So welcome to both Tom van den Kendeler and Jamie Shea. Excellent to have you here today. And just a couple of final words on the rules and the way we're going to conduct this event. So both speakers will deliver brief opening remarks. Afterwards, there will be an open discussion and a Q&A like with the online audience. And to those of you who are kind of following the live stream, you can ask questions from the speakers by posting them on the event's Facebook page. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Sean van den Kendele. Please, the floor is yours. What do you think about the current state of EU-NATO cooperation and where it could go in the future?
Nicholas, thank you very much for your introduction and kind words, and good morning to you and to the audience online. I think, first of all, I need to say this is a very timely event. If we see NATO is gearing up for its summit later this year, we had the visit of Anthony Blinken last week. And for all Parliament fans out there, there is an EU-NATO relations report being drafted by my good colleague and EPP Secretary General, Antonio Lopez. I think, indeed, the timing is very right. On the EU-NATO cooperation, there is a lot to be said, and allow me a few of introductory observations, I would say. Both have started off very differently back in the days when I wasn't even born yet, but in fact have a very similar task in front of them. On the one hand, NATO is a defensive military alliance. On the other hand, the EU is a political organization, but both are evolving and have to evolve in a very rapidly changing geopolitical context on a strong common ground of solidarity. Solidarity that is indeed under pressure, we need to underline. It is important because the threats have also been developing over the past few years. Traditional territorial defense has been, I would say, developing into fight against terrorism, hybrid threats, disinformation, cyber attacks, and they indeed also include challenges linked to technological developments such as disruptive technologies and non-military threats with security implications like climate change or pandemics. And what we increasingly see that is that politics and the economy are also tools being used to undermine societies and to undermine solidarity in those societies and to create chaos. Conflicts indeed are toughening and areas of tension are widening. So the world has changed drastically since NATO's strategic concept was adopted in 2010. I also think still of the annexation of Crimea, I think of Syria, obviously, the erosion that we're seeing of multilateralism, the return of systemic rivalry, as some call it. We've had Brexit in the EU with obviously strong consequences, I think, for the geopolitical position of the EU. We have had, let's say, the passage of a remarkable US president and the unpredictable and unrecognizable foreign policy choices that were a consequence of it. Luckily, that is now past us. Just to say that this has all been having major effects, not only on NATO, also on the EU. And I think, therefore, it is time that both really do some self-reflection, but that both also have even more than a conversation between themselves to prepare for the next decade. Unfortunately, and that's really the positive thing, and that would be my first key message and for my observation, there is a momentum coming for strengthening that EU-NATO cooperation. There is a momentum coming for both to talk to each other really deeply. Now, when looking at the current state of the cooperation, well, I think we need to start with the basics. They have always been and they will always be each other's first strategic partners. Peace in Europe for more than 7 decades is more, I think, than a historic exception, of which NATO indeed remains the guardian. And we can only wonder what would have happened to the EU if we hadn't had NATO. So maintaining the alliance at the military level is crucial for both. Over the past 70 years, NATO has also been key to that peace and stability, but also, I think, to the political and economic successes of the EU. After 5 years, since 2016, I think the first thing we can see is that there is indeed more convergence. And the whole process of implementation represents a strong basis also for better interaction at precisely this point this time, because there is a certain existence of mutual trust, a willingness of voluntarism, I think, for cooperation. You are right in saying that some of the proposals that have been picked up are indeed leading to results, but that overall results could appear as meager. Three things I pick up on. Medical cooperation, for example, has significantly deepened as the pandemic has evolved. So there is indeed frequent and rapid information exchange. Medical advice has become harmonized. I think that's only a plus. We see that there is better cooperation with third countries by coordinating efforts. We see that there is a regular staff dialogue between EU and NATO on operational cooperation. I think these are very positive points, but as positive as those examples might be, indeed, there is still a lot of room for improvement. And I see two clear challenges when it comes to the list of 74 proposals. First challenge. In the December meeting with the Commission and the EAS and the EDA, the COP's ambassadors rightfully underlined the need for new tangible results in the field of military mobility, but also in the fight against hybrid threats and disinformation. Moreover, there is the strengthening of resilience, including towards China, and there is our cyber defense capacity, which really needs to be upgraded. The fact that we have made progress in cooperation is good, but I think we all agree that we want to see progress in exactly those fields that are of high political salience today. In essence, it should really be still more about deepening what we're doing together rather than thinking about taking on new things together. A second challenge which I see is the lack of clear benchmarking for those 74 proposals. In earlier debates, I have always considered those 74 proposals as a to-do list, which could easily be ticked off. But for something to be ticked off, as we all know from our shopping lists at home, we need clear benchmarking on what could be considered a success and what is not a success. There needs to be a certain mutual understanding of how we consider successes, a mutual understanding, obviously, between EU and NATO. So voluntarism between the two is great, yet tangible results are better. In the same period since 2016, what I really and unequivocally see as a great success is that we've seen more progress in the EU defense in those years as compared to the sum of the last decades, even, I would say. The new self-described geopolitical European Commission has created a new DG DEFIS in charge of defense industry. There is PESCO, there is the European Defense Fund, and member states really are in the process of launching their strategic compass with the support of the EAS and the Commission. It is now key for the European Commission and for all of us to keep this agenda on track, to make sure that the EDF money is well spent, that the budgets for military mobility and the European Peace Facility are well spent, and to indeed deliver, I would say, on the strategic compass. Now, when it comes to further boosting EU-NATO cooperation and what challenges there exist, I think there is only one line that can summarize it, namely, at some point, those respective reflection processes should converge towards each other. We indeed find ourselves in a unique situation. The two processes are happening simultaneously. The EU strategic compass, the strategic concept of NATO that is expected indeed to be launched before summer. So those must come to cohesive conclusions, but I think they would definitely benefit from convergence towards one another at some point. And as I see it, the strategic compass could lay the foundations for a EU contribution to the NATO strategic concept. And that, I think, would be my second key message of today. If we were to have a stronger EU on that front, it would only be to the benefit of a stronger NATO later on. NATO is indeed highly developed in the military dimension, but could strengthen its political dimension. And the inverse is true for the EU, or the opposite is true. Politically, it's highly developed, but I think we all agree that it should invest more in strengthening its defense. And that is why, or that is at least what the EU has been attempting to do, but where now we need to see delivery of results. Very important, I think, to improve cooperation between both organizations. And one of the key aspects there is to really upgrade the political dialogue and strengthen the political dialogue between the two. We have seen indeed I would call it symbolic but important participations of the NATO Secretary General to the College of Commissioners last year. We've seen the High Representative of the EU attending meetings of the NATO defense ministers. So that is indeed very good and would have been unthinkable a few years ago. But I think there should be more and more regular special summits with the participation of all, and I underline all, NATO and EU heads of state and government. And maybe a few other observations or reflections I would like to make when it comes to upgrading EU-NATO cooperation. I think, first of all, we all need to think about how we could upgrade and update the legal framework for cooperation. The framework, as we all know, is still based on the 2003 agreed framework. Now, since 2003, a lot has happened, and I think we need to really think about how we could indeed update that agreement. Secondly, we need to develop capabilities and especially also the coherence of capabilities. Member states should continue to develop. I think that message has been clear through PESCO and with support of the European Defence Fund. And those capabilities could then be used by either of the organizations. Like you rightly said, Nicholas, yourself in 2018, the Sleeping Beauty really cannot afford to keep pushing that snooze button any longer. And one of the criteria for PESCO projects is indeed whether it fulfills NATO priorities. I think at the time that was a great thought, but we see now that it becomes all the more relevant. Indeed, it helps to avoid unnecessary duplication. Last but not least, reflection on how to upgrade and update our cooperation. I think we definitely need to think about how to articulate, on the one hand, Article 5 of NATO, and on the other hand, Article 42, paragraph 7 of the Lisbon Treaty. Both have obviously expressing solidarity at its core, solidarity in times of crisis at its core, but I think we urgently need to clarify how and which article we should invoke as a result of which organization to refer them to in a case of crisis, in order precisely to reduce the risk of competition and duplication. And the final key message I would have is that really it is time for the EU to move from soft power to autonomy to act. Rather than falling into the trap of competing between each other, I think we should make sure that the upgrade of NATO as a political organization should not detract the EU from its own efforts that clearly need to be done towards more sovereignty by adopting more responsibility for its own security and defense. And I think, and again, I really wish to emphasize that message, sovereignty or strategic autonomy of the EU by no means stands for or stands against more efficiency or further upgrading of NATO and its partnership with the EU. On the contrary, I think both would go hand in hand. So the EU is continuing its integration process on its path from being that soft, from I'd say, moving from a soft power towards having the autonomy, or at least more autonomy to act. And this is definitely something that the EU needs to keep doing and to urgently needs to do. I think the future of the EU-NATO relations in the next decade will rest, therefore, in the hands of Europe. One of the key questions will be and will remain how Europeans will indeed reconcile Eurocentrism on the one hand and transatlanticism on the other hand. I think they should be reconciled, and that is, I think, where I would like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. van den Kendeler. Just to pick up on kind of one point, like you mentioned, because you said that the two kind of parallel processes in the EU and NATO, the strategic compass and then the forthcoming strategic concept process, like should converge towards each other. I was just wondering, I mean, if you have any ideas on how this could happen, like in practice. I mean, what would convergence like mean in practical terms?
Well, whenever, especially the Europeans are making progress with their work on the strategic compass, we're expecting a delivery there or a result there in 2022 under the French presidency. I think even in an earlier stage in the course of this year, later this year, a strategic summit where EU leaders and NATO leaders sit together and come together to exchange on where this exercise is going towards. I think this could definitely benefit from an exercise of convergence that would happen then.
Thank you so much. Professor Shea, the floor is yours. How do you see the current state of EU-NATO cooperation and where it might be going, and especially like given your kind of experience like from within NATO, so it'd be very interesting to hear.
Well, Nicholas, thanks very much, and to the Martin Centre for inviting me back. Tom, it's great to have a debate with you today. You spoke a lot about strategic convergence, and I think inevitably there's going to be between you and I today also a certain amount of strategic convergence, because I nodded at many of the points that you made, and I'll also try to look at this very much from a NATO perspective. But Tom, you sort of, without naming her, sort of referred to something that Federica Mogherini liked to say about European defence, that it had made more progress in the last 10 months than in the previous 10 years. And sort of paraphrasing or riffing on the back of that, I would say that NATO-EU cooperation has probably made more progress in the last 4 years than in the previous 40. I mean, if you look back, of course, things are massively better than they once were. I mean, I recall a US ambassador who used to moan on about the fact that the NATO and the EU were two institutions in the same city, but existing on different planets. Myself and a colleague, we once wrote a speech for Jaap de Hoop Scheffer when he was NATO Secretary General, when he described NATO-EU relations as a frozen conflict, which certainly upset his counterparts in the EU at the time. But it was, in fact, a reflection of a certain frustration, a certain reality. It was impossible for, even at the staff level, to speak to the other part of town, except at places like the Martin Centre, and in an atmosphere of smoke-filled rooms and clandestinity. And so if you think of those bad old days, I mean, obviously, the two joint declarations that Nicholas referred to, the 74 practical areas of cooperation, the fact that now Secretary General Stoltenberg is invited to virtually all of the defense ministers' meetings, many of the foreign ministers' meetings, the summits also where foreign policy and defense is discussed, the fact, as you said, Tom, that the High Rep turns up at NATO meetings, but not just a high rep. I mean, there was a time when our contacts at NATO, I say ours, if was still there, but where NATO's contacts were really very much constrained to the intergovernmental side of the EU, the External Action Service, the Council. NATO couldn't really speak to the Commission, and that was a source of frustration, because the Commission, particularly in terms of its aid budget and its foreign policy and development activities in places like Afghanistan or the Western Balkans, where NATO needed to see more development to accompany its military missions, being able to have a dialogue with the Commission and coordinate was absolutely essential. But now, fortunately, that barrier has been lifted as well, and commissioners, the chief executive of the European Defence Agency, have visited NATO frequently to discuss particularly issues that you referred to, Tom, like dealing with hybrid warfare, the grey zone, non-conventional threats, and building resilience as well. So it clearly is a lot better these days. But that said, one of the lessons I learned from the first EU High Representative, Javier Solana, who was also my old boss at NATO as Secretary General, and Solana was a physicist, that speed is relative. And if you're developing quickly, but unfortunately the security environment is changing even more quickly around you, then you may think you're going forward, but in fact you're actually going backwards. And therefore, the way, Nicholas, that you characterized the relationship in your introduction, which is it's good, but is it good enough? Given the challenges we're facing, is it really achieving its potential? And you mentioned, if you speak to the average voter on the Grand Place in Brussels and say, what has NATO-EU cooperation done to improve your security over the last 12 months? Well, that person may be hard to sort of come up with a practical example. Talking to each other is good. Lifting the taboos on taking a taxi to the other side of town and actually being able to get into the building and talk to who you want to talk to. These are very good. But Tom, you mentioned yourself, this kind of consultation and dialogue has to produce sort of more concrete results. Now, I think looking back over the last couple of years, there have been some good things. For example, when I was still at NATO, we signed a technical arrangement with the EU on cooperation on cyber security. and cyber defense. And I remember when we had that sort of big bug coming out of North Korea called WannaCry a few years ago, which started to impact on European industry. It put the National Health Service in my country, the UK, out of action for several days. The ability between the NATO integrated cyber response capability at Mons and the EU CERT to exchange real-time information on what they were seeing, giving each other early warning, exchanging forensics, analyzing malware, that type of thing was extremely precious. You mentioned military mobility. Of course, that's moved on quite well, where the EU, of course, in the new financial framework has a dedicated budget, not as much, I think, as everybody was hoping for originally, but still a budget for pushing forward with military mobility in the hands of the Netherlands. NATO has a similar group, and of course, in the ability of the EU to upgrade infrastructure, which will not only make it easier for European citizens to move quickly around the future of Europe, but also tanks and troops and armored personnel carriers. If NATO ever has to perform a collective defense mission in the future, that is extremely useful as well. Again, I think we had an excellent example in the Balkans in the you mentioned, Nicholas, with Concordia at that time when Javier Solana as the High Rep and George Robertson as his successor as the NATO Secretary General were able together to go down to Skopje at a time when the country risked to lapse into civil war. Today, it's of course a member of NATO as North Macedonia, and with their sort of respective instruments of their respective institutions, they were able to offer all of the carrots and sticks necessary to pull off the Ohrid peace framework. So we've had some good concrete examples, I think, where the relationship has worked. But of course, we need more such examples, and we need these to be more in a strategic concept. Now, looking to the future, where do we need to go? Well, I think there are sort of 5 or 6 things that I would like to focus on in terms of where we could go. Because the problem with 74 is that you get stuck in the kind of weeds of sort of, and I've quoted a few, sort of individual practical examples of cooperation, often driven by crises, which don't necessarily lead to any lessons learned or new institutional arrangements once the crisis is over. In other words, it was good while it lasted. And if we're going to sort of bring the institutions together in a more systematic sense, well, I think we need to sort of go beyond 74 useful things that we can do and look for the real big strategic things that would really push the relationship forward. And that's what I'd like briefly to mention. Number one is to take a new look at Berlin Plus. This was an arrangement, you mentioned it, Nicholas, that we agreed to around the turn of the century, but it only was used twice because in the eyes of some, particularly France, but others in the EU, it sort of led to a kind of feeling that the EU would be subordinated to NATO, which would have the first choice of operations, and that the role of the EU in terms of its foreign and security defense policy would be to take over NATO operations when NATO got tired of doing those operations. For example, like Althea, which you mentioned, Nicholas, in Bosnia in 2004. But we're now in a much more complicated situation. We've got EU maritime operations, we've had the counter-piracy operation, we've had, of course, the operations in the Mediterranean. We now, of course, have the EU stepping up its role, particularly in the Sahel with the EUTMs. You mentioned also, Tom, the new European Peace Facility, which will also give the European Union a much greater role in training. And you see that certain non-EU member states are also on the ground with the EU in that region. For example, my own country, the UK, is now contributing to the MINUSCA peacekeeping force in Mali. We have also the United States helping out the EU. So we're in a much more complicated situation where it's, we're all sort of participating in some shape or form in each other's operations. And so my first sort of view would be to take a new look at Berlin Plus to make it more flexible, to give the EU greater access to the NATO command structure, particularly, for example, Joint Forces Command Naples, the hub for the South, given that the EU is focusing a lot of its effort on Africa at the moment, to see how the resources, intelligence, military planning, help of that command structure could be used. I mean, a good example, of course, has been the operations in the central Mediterranean, where the Sophia EU operation was in the lead as we tried to deal with maritime security and particularly the problem of illegal migration, but where NATO, with its own operation, was able to provide, tanker support, logistic support. So first idea, let's see if we can sort of have a kind of a Berlin Plus for the 21st century, which corresponds to the new realities of what the two organizations are doing. Secondly, European strategic autonomy. I think, need to come to some kind of joint understanding between NATO and the EU as to what it really means. And to what extent it can benefit NATO as well as the European Union. I'm a fan of European strategic autonomy because I think that if the United States wants better burden sharing from the Europeans, it presupposes that the Europeans have to organize themselves and integrate themselves in a way that's going to get more value from the euros that they're spending on defense. Otherwise, if we stick with these national stovepipes, a great deal of the extra money, the 2% of GDP, the NATO target for the defense investment pledge, a lot of that extra money will be wasted through not being used for joint programs. And obviously the European Defence Fund and PESCO, Tom, you mentioned that, lead the way in the EU as to how we can make better use of that money. And therefore, what I would like, of course, would be that the EU could be able to sell the idea of European strategic autonomy better in the United States, where there is definitely, let's be honest about it, has been for some time a kind of narrative problem in what that means in a way that it benefits NATO, and could also tie European strategic autonomy. Tom, you mentioned this in terms of PESCO being compatible with NATO capability targets and so on, and the two organizations integrating more their defense planning in a way that the various objectives of European strategic autonomy, which also go into the area of supply chain security and so on, could benefit what NATO is doing as well. But the idea is not going to go away. It's not just President Macron. The Europeans are not going to give up on this, and I think there is a lot of good sense in that. But we have sometimes in NATO, as you know, a misunderstanding gap, as if it implies that Europe wants to take over the role of European defense alone and doesn't need the United States any longer, or wants to be a kind of third force in the world between the United States and China. We need, I think, at least with the EU, and this is, I think, what the strategic compass could usefully do as a feed in to the NATO strategic concept, is to define once and for all this rather fluid concept of European strategic autonomy in a way that clearly shows the benefits to transatlantic security. The third thing, and this builds on this, is we're now in a sort of situation today where the EU is one of the most powerful economic and when it gets its act together, diplomatic players in the world, but which only contributes 22% of its overall security budget. The rest is provided by NATO. Europe is defended essentially by non-EU countries. We have now in the West, in the North Sea and the Atlantic approaches, by a UK which has departed the Union. I may regret this personally, but it's a reality, by the Canada, the United States, up in the Arctic, by Norway, in the Eastern Mediterranean area, and in the Middle East, and around the Black Sea by Turkey. It's a unique situation. And I can't imagine that the Chinese or the United States would ever allow themselves to be in that kind of situation of having sort of subcontracted their defense to allies and partners. Well, they're allies and partners, so it all works and we're happy about that. But we are now going back to collective defense after Russia annexed Crimea, at a time when we don't have 326,000 US forces in Europe to defend forward. Forward defense today is essentially done by Europeans. And I welcome that, because I think it's a very good shift of responsibility. Canada leads a battalion, the United States, of course, a reinforced brigade in Poland, but only one EU country, Germany now, leads one of the multinational battalions in the East, although many EU countries, of course, participate in those battalions in other ways. So one of the things I think the EU should do is not sort of launch into the debate suggesting that it's going to replace the United States or NATO. No, NATO is still for collective defense. But I think the EU, instead of always defining the common foreign security and defense policy as, we go off to Africa and we don't really do anything when it comes to the collective defense of Europe, I think the EU could start gradually looking at ways, maybe using the battle groups in the Baltic states or more maritime presence in the Arctic or in the Black Sea, in the Baltic, missile defense. I mean, there are a number of special forces, a greater contribution of EU special forces. The EU, I think, could at least have a reflection on how it could also start taking over certain aspects of the collective defense, given that it is now today largely a European affair, where, of course, we would count on Europeans to defend our borders in the first instance with the United States. But the role of the US would be much more today sending over reinforcements than fighting the initial battle, which would have definitely been the case in the Cold War. The next thing is resilience. Tom, you mentioned this, and I can only endorse. We are now, of course, facing a new type of warfare, which, unlike, thank God, conventional warfare, is not a very remote contingency, even though potentially catastrophic. We're dealing with things that go bang, whether in the cyber domain or with our critical infrastructure or our information environment or our financial sector. Every day of the week, and building resilience is going to be very key, whether these come in the form of pandemics, you mentioned that, Tom, or freak weather events caused by climate change. Both NATO and the EU are looking into these areas at the moment, protecting our information technology, the endless debate about how much to have self-reliance versus how much to continue to rely upon the forces of globalization and just-in-time delivery. These are very important debates for both of us. And I think going into this, both institutions have complementary assets. I mean, the EU can regulate the environment. Think of the NIS directive when it came to cybersecurity in a way that enhances the standards that benefit NATO cyber defense. On the other hand, NATO has the very sophisticated intelligence network, the network of partner countries, which is a global network, which the EU doesn't have, or at least doesn't yet have. NATO has also a very large civil emergency planning apparatus inherited from the Cold War, in the sense of being able to monitor the vulnerabilities and what allies are doing. So we are perfect partners in the area of resilience, but because it's so vital to us, in terms of joint exercises and harmonizing procedures, we need to step up on this. Now, two things to mention, Nicholas, very briefly, and I'm going to stop. Very briefly, what I think is lacking in the NATO-EU relationship is the focus on joint strategy vis-a-vis regions. We do coordinate over the Balkans, thank God. And I mentioned the Javier Solana, George Robertson duet back in 2001, because we share the missions. You pointed that out, Nicholas. We have a joint presence on the ground. We have the processes of enlargement and the rest. So the Balkans is perhaps a good example where we've cooperated. But this old idea that maybe existed in some quarters of Brussels, if I can speak frankly, whereby, NATO was a bit toxic, because of the bad relationship with Russia, the bad relationship with maybe some North African countries in the wake of Libya, and somehow the EU, being a more economic civilian-based institution, was more favorably looked upon. Well, after what we've seen with China and the EU sanctions on the Uyghurs over the last couple of days, or Josep Borrell's visit to Moscow to see Lavrov and so on, let's be frank, we are both now, in terms of the capacity of the institutions to represent democracies, we're both now up in a fight against the authoritarians, and the authoritarians don't like the EU any more than they like NATO. And therefore, when it comes to our vital equities, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, Azerbaijan, endless, the countries in between, these important countries whose cooperation and stability is vital for our own security. What is lacking to my mind is the sense of really developing a joint strategy. We have not seen a high representative and the NATO Secretary General travel together to these crisis areas in the way that they once did with North Macedonia. And this is what I think we need to look at. Finally, one of the key things I think for the future NATO-EU relationship is also going to be the ability of the EU to entice my country, the UK, back into an institutionalized, structured relationship post-Brexit. I was in a debate on the UK integrated review this past week, and one thing that was glaringly obvious is that although the UK is recommitting to NATO as part of its integrated review, very, very, very little was said about its future defence arrangements with the European Union. But of course, the UK has been involved in the past. It led the mission on counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden. It is now spending a lot on defence. It's modernising cyber command, space command, special brigades to deal with hybrid scenarios. It would be a tremendous pity if the EU and the UK were not able to pool their resources and share intelligence and work together in a way that they were starting to do, paradoxically, at the very moment when we had the Brexit referendum result. I could also mention Turkey, because this is another difficult, let's be honest, prickly and difficult partner for the EU at the moment, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, but whose cooperation with the EU is also going to be fundamental for the success of the common foreign and security policy. Thank God relations are easier with Canada, Norway, and the United States today, but the diplomatic ability of the EU to work, particularly with the UK and Turkey, both bilaterally and within the EU-NATO dialogue, and get them sort of fully back inside the tent, if you like, contributing in a harmonious way, I think is going to be important too. So final word on the compass, and Tom, I agree on NATO strategic concept. We've got a 6-month overlap, because I understand that President Macron would like to get the compass finished at the start of the French presidency early next year. NATO should kick off in June. So we have maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months. Tom, what you say about a summit is interesting there, to try to bring the organizations closer together. We need, on the one hand, a kind of, although NATO and the EU would never use the term, a division of labor, so that the two organizations are not constantly sort of treading on each other's toes. I like the idea of, certain areas, one organization is naturally in the lead and the other supports, and then vice versa. For another dossier, the other organization is more naturally in the lead and other supports. But where, particularly in the hybrid regional conflict capability area, there are obvious overlaps, we need to make sure that those overlaps are being carefully exploited, and a consultation on the strategic concept and the strategic compass can maybe help to ensure that we take out of those 74 in the weeds individual sort of activities that larger strategic vision on the key priorities, which I've tried to outline in my brief, but no doubt for you, Mr. Chairman, too lengthy introductory remarks today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And I think we can kind of jump straight into the kind of discussion bit. So we have about kind of just a little bit more than 15 minutes. So I have tons of questions, and we have some like from the audience already. So I think to kind of go through them, I mean, I'll ask some of them, and then I'd kind of ask both of you to give answers, but as briefly as possible, so we can kind of cover kind of multiple ones of them. This kind of ties, one thing I have in mind ties quite closely to like what Jamie said at the very end of his remarks, which is like Brexit and the implications of Brexit, like for EU-NATO cooperation. Like in your opinion, like how has Brexit had already kind of implications for EU-NATO cooperation, and if so, what kind of implications? And because I'm asking this because the UK kind of used to be the most Atlanticist member state in the European Union and the strongest champion of EU-NATO cooperation. And now, given that it's no longer an EU member, but still an ally in NATO, I mean, the dynamics like might be a little bit different. So let's start with Tom. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, well, I'm not telling anything new if I think we can say that we all regret United Kingdom has left, if only for that reason, if only for the the security and defense role it took up in the European Union. What struck me is that Boris Johnson didn't want to hold security and defense talks within the negotiations of the cooperation agreement. And that makes it all the more difficult, I would say, for the EU today to kind of have a normalized discussion on that if it weren't for NATO. And this would be, I think, the answer. Luckily, there is NATO because, as is also the case for Turkey and the US, it will now be the only multilateral forum for the moment where we will be able to have a dialogue on security and defense with the UK. So again, there NATO is proving its worth for EU member states after the regrettable exit of the UK.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, on that, and Tom, yes, thanks. I would say that the first thing is that it's good that in the integrated review, the UK has said that Russia is the biggest challenge, notwithstanding the press coverage on the integrated review, which has tended to accentuate, the shift to the Asia Pacific, China. But if you look at the text, Russia is still the number one, and NATO is the number one priority. And the UK is increasing its defence spending to 2.2% of GDP, and it's improving in areas which are key to NATO: cyber, space, special forces, high-tech forces operating in the hybrid warfare area. So, providing, of course, all of that wonderful equipment is delivered to compensate for the cut in forces, then NATO should benefit. The only worry, and again, this is a debate among experts, is whether smaller but higher quality compensates for larger but lower quality. For example, if you're dealing with Russia, do you just need special forces, even though they are super data equipped, or do you still need a lot of ships and a lot of tanks and a lot of aircraft? I mean, that's a debate which NATO is going to have among its own members, and also with the UK. Can you fight, a peer adversary with just high tech alone? I don't know. It's a good question. But first point, the UK is fully committed to NATO, which means it will be fully committed to Europe. The UK, and Tom, you pointed this out, is going to be more dependent now on a high quality NATO-EU dialogue. Third point is that I think that, as for the time being, we need to leave the post-Brexit, self-affirmation of global Britain. We need to leave the dust to settle a little bit on that in London. So we'll have to play a waiting game before I think the UK will seek to re-establish a defence relationship with the EU institutions. So in the meantime, very important to continue with all of the other ways in which the UK is doing things with EU member states. France, Lancaster House, the UK contribution to the Sahel, the maritime stuff, Franco, British nuclear talks, the Northern Group, the Netherlands, UK amphibious battalion, etc., etc., etc. The UK is very keen on this bilateral stuff, and it may not be a substitute in the long term for talking to Brussels, but it still keeps the UK in the game. And finally, I hope that the UK won't try to play NATO off against the EU. In other words, upset the EU by trying to move a lot of things that the EU does today, like the training bit, into NATO, but that the UK will, see that the EU still has its value and work as a reliable and constructive partner, even if it's in NATO. So those would be my thoughts.
Thanks a lot. I'll take two questions like that were coming from the audience, and I'll ask them at the same time. And again, let's have a short answer so we can go through these. First question relates to the issue of Turkey, which Jamie already mentioned, and it's about, what can be or could perhaps be done to kind of unblock the issues and the kind of obstacles that the issues with Turkey currently create for EU-NATO cooperation, because there are some political issues that have in the past and continue to create issues, especially in the field of operational domain. The second question is about the impact of China. So how does China, what kind of challenges that China represent to NATO, and perhaps a follow-up question to that, what it means for EU-NATO cooperation? Thank you. And let's start with Tom again.
Well, thank you for those two important questions, and actually sum up. Those questions illustrate very well exactly the two difficulties NATO and NATO-EU cooperation are facing both internally and externally. On Turkey, we all know that the non-recognition of the Republic of Cyprus by Turkey has been blocking Cyprus' accession to NATO. Yet, at the same time, NATO is again here the only forum where we can really talk through security and defense with Turkey. So in that sense, I would consider myself as a pragmatic voluntarist, if I may put it that way, in the sense that the geostrategic interests for the EU in terms of migration, in terms of security and defense are much higher as compared to the other questions on the table. And there I would really want to see or to say that it has to be seen through the lens of NATO. So the way in which we approach Turkey definitely has to be seen through NATO's lens. On China, well, very difficult to put all of this in one answer. What I do see is that EU is slowly but surely also moving towards strategic autonomy in terms of its relations with China. The CAI is obviously part of that, and I'm very curious to see how this discussion will roll out in the European Parliament. But we need to be frank and honest with each other. We want to cooperate with China wherever that is possible. We will be competing wherever it's necessary, and we will be in conflict with them wherever it's unavoidable. And the resilience part that Jamie spoke of in his intervention, I think there is crucial. It would be naive to believe that better cooperation, for example, in terms of CAI or other, would lead China to think less of in strategic terms about the EU and about NATO. So in that sense, we definitely would have to build up resilience in a much stronger and a quicker way to be able to stand ready to tackle China.
Thanks, Jamie.
Very briefly, Nicholas, on Turkey, I think it's a question of the long game. And fortunately, NATO is good at playing the long game because it starts from the assumption that although from time to time NATO can have complicated relations with its own members, let alone countries outside the alliance, keeping them inside the tent as part of the Western democratic community is always better than having them on the outside. That's definitely the case with an important player like Turkey. And I really, take my hat off to the Secretary General of NATO, in all fairness, not just for the way he handled Donald Trump, which was not easy, but in a way that meant that Trump never did deliver on his threats to withdraw from the alliance, and eventually persuaded Trump to see European defense spending as a positive rather than a negative story. And I also, salute the Sec Gen for the way he's been in Ankara and really kept a channel of communication going with President Erdogan. I know it's not easy to do this, but keeping that dialogue going is key. And Turkey plays host to a number of important NATO bases, the Land Cent Command in Izmir, missile defense, a number of air bases. It's very important, for NATO's operations if it's going to be a global actor. Turkey participates in a lot of NATO operations as well. Often its record in NATO, if you like, is probably easier than sometimes its record in dealing with the bilateral issues with the EU. So the key thing is that Turkey is still a democracy. There's a big difference always, to my mind, between countries where, notwithstanding difficulties, that the elections are still free and fair and political change is still possible, and then countries which become autocracies where that they have elections, but the result will never, at least not for a generation or so, ever change. And Turkey, still being a democracy, is an important country to deal with. But alignment between the EU and the United States, the Biden administration, as it re-engages Turkey, I think is going to be very important. What NATO has done, as you know, Nicholas, has at least been been able to defuse some of the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean by they're getting under the NATO umbrella, Greece and Turkey, to come around the table and deal with data exchanges, incident handling, recognize their picture, avoiding a clash that could escalate into any kind of armed clash. Let's put it that way. On China, we could talk about this for many hours. My sense, and I totally agree with Tom, so I don't need to say much on this, is that NATO and the EU, when it comes to Chinese influence in Europe, in our backyard, through technology, through acquisition of ports, through acquisition of important companies, control of supply chains, particularly on the back of the One Belt, One Road, and how that could potentially paralyze NATO in an actual crisis if China exerted leverage on those infrastructure or financial assets. That kind of intelligence sharing is going to be crystal clear. Whether NATO or the EU as institutions then have a role in the Asia Pacific area, as opposed to individual allies like the UK putting an aircraft carrier there in the autumn, or France or Germany, or even Belgium that sent a ship to an exercise in the Indo-Pacific, whether we then sort of see an institutional role there, apart from being helpful on the diplomatic front. I think that is going to be a good discussion where the harmonization, or at least a dialogue on the strategic compass and the strategic concept, to clarify a little bit the intention there, would be a very, very sort of useful exercise.
Thank you. Something I also wanted to ask you about, and I think this will be the final question, given the amount of time we have left, concerns the news that the Americans are seeking to participate in the EU's permanent structured cooperation framework in the military mobility project that I think both of you mentioned earlier. So I wanted to ask, do you think that this could also have some kind of positive ripple effects on EU-NATO cooperation more broadly? Given if the US participation in PESCO is approved in May by the Foreign Affairs Council, which looks very likely at the moment. And let's go with Tom again first.
Difficult to say, to be honest. I think it's good that we're looking in a positive way at the way in which US and EU are looking at each other again, as compared to the last years. Difficult to speak out whether this indeed would be positive or negative. But what I keep in mind is the even though I think the core message of the US won't change fundamentally in terms of its NATO and European member countries' role in NATO, I think we should only be happy about the fact that the dialogue is going on again, and that really it is about concrete matters. That is what I really like to highlight.
Well, to my mind, Nicholas, whenever I was sort of following this during this lockdown, during the lockdown, as you know, we're all able to do a lot of webinars. So I've been able to tune in to, webinars in Washington in the think tank community and follow the debate. And when this issue of PESCO came up, or the EDF, the American view was not so much, if you like, on the overall policy or strategy, should the Europeans do this? It always came down to exactly what you were talking about, Nicholas. Are our industries going to be shut out? Are we going to lose market share? They were much more worried about this sort of more practical aspect than the overall idea. So I think what the EU has done in terms of third-party access, and the US has now come forward with military mobility and a few other ideas, is enormously positive in, if you like, diffusing some of the reluctance and the objection to that, and it makes sense. But this is not the only thing that matters. If we're going to deal with the Chinese challenge and even the Russian challenge at a time when they're investing massively in new technologies like visualization and artificial intelligence and all of that, we need to have a much greater EU-US dialogue on technology sharing. What the US used to call the third industrial offset, and how we share technology and harmonize things that have stood in the way of that, like privacy rules or data exchange or taxation on companies. And I was struck very much by Tony Blinken last week when he finished his meeting at the EU, saying, look, if we're going to stand up to the Chinese challenge, we need to become less dependent upon the Chinese economy. and we therefore need to integrate more our own economies, and that also has to be in defense. And so I think the PESCO EDF has to only be the beginning of a much wider sharing of know-how, technology, science, research and development across the Atlantic. It can't just be the old, the United States sells 7 times more to us than we're able to sell to them. They have to become far less protectionist. And I think for the Biden administration, which on the one hand wants to develop this kind of integrated Western democratic, defense industrial space, but on the other hand is very protectionist when it comes to jobs and, not making sure that American companies get most of the business. I think the Biden administration is going to have to come to terms with this sort of dilemma and really sort of demonstrate practically by allowing the EU in to the American defense market that it really means it when it talks about this new integrated democratic zone. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, and I think this discussion could probably go on for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. It's been fascinating to listen to both of you about like where EU-NATO cooperation is and where it might be heading, and I kind of got the sense that like what has been done in the past, I mean, it's positive, but it's not as positive as it could be. And we're now in a place where there might perhaps be kind of a greater opportunity than any time in the previous future to kind of at least try to boost the cooperation between the EU and NATO, mainly due to the strategic compass process, the strategic concept process, and then having the new Biden administration in the US. And given obviously the very broad list of common challenges that like both the EU and NATO as organizations are facing, which structurally can also then pushes them to cooperate more effectively. We shall see where these pressures will take the two organizations, but I would like to again thank both Tom van den Kendelare and Jamie Shea for participating in this discussion, and for everyone who tuned in the cyberspace to follow today's discussion. So thanks a lot to all of you. Thanks for posting questions, and stay tuned for the next events that we're going to organize. Ciao.